Okay, good afternoon everybody. Thank you for coming to hear all about pensions. It's not going to be great news, I'm sure, but it's important stuff. Right, my name's Sam Marsh. I'm the Communications Officer for the branch here, the UCU branch. I'm also a university teacher in the School of Maths. To my left we've got Matthew Malek, who some of you may know. He's the Pensions Officer for the branch, and he's also a lecturer in the Physics Department. And then to his left we've got Carlo Morelli, who's our guest for today. He's come down from Dundee, Senior Lecturer in Economics, but more importantly he's one of the elected national negotiators to represent USS members in the discussions that are currently ongoing and fairly fraught on the future of USS. Carlo's got to leave at about 1:45, so I think without further ado we'll hand over to him to hear the situation from his point of view. You want to say something?
I thought you were going to show your stuff first.
Oh no, I was planning to do that after Carlo. So after Carlo's spoken, I've got a few slides that I might whiz through, some graphs on how this fund is looking, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. That's the plan. Right, okay, so hopefully this microphone will work. Over to you, Carlo.
Right, thanks for inviting me to come. Hopefully you can hear that. Right, so my name's Carlo Morelli. I'm at Dundee University. If you want to email me afterwards or send me some comments, there aren't many Carlo Morellis at Dundee University, so it's quite easy to find, okay? I'm in economic studies, so just drop me an email. I'm like you guys, I've got 20 years in the scheme. I've got at least another, 13 years to go in the scheme, if not more. And so I've got a direct interest in terms of what the outcome of this is, just as you lot have, okay? Couple of key points I want to get across. There is currently a ballot taking place, being organised by UCU on the question of industrial action to defend our pension scheme. You must send that ballot paper in. We're recommending that you vote yes on both questions for industrial action, and we need that ballot to cross the 50% threshold that is now the industrial relations legislation. So it really is important that people find those ballot papers and submit them. So please do. And talk to people in your department, your office, wherever you're based, about them submitting their form as well. You're the same as me. We get loads and loads of posts. It gets put under a pile, and then we can't find it. Please make sure they get submitted as soon as possible. Okay? If you're not a member, you can join. I'd encourage you to. And if you're not a member and you don't want to join, you still need to make sure you're aware of what's happening in pensions over the next few weeks and months, because this is extremely important. I don't want to suggest anything other than I think the changes that are coming about could potentially completely unravel our pension scheme and our entitlement to retirement. Now, don't let me suggest that I'm exaggerating. Let me read to you one of the documents that the employers have sent to us, which explains their views on this. Okay, I'm going to read it to you. Here we go. It says, in relation to the provisions relating to the definition of retirement, there are no immediate plans to change the existing arrangements. However, employers are committed, within the Joint Negotiating Committee, to a review of the entire concept of retirement under the USS rules, with a view to providing members with some new additional options. That's where this is going. The potential for the pension scheme to unravel is real. And that's what I just want to say a little bit about. And that's what makes this so significant. And the consequences for members are dire. All of the changes suggest, and you can model this in any way you like, it doesn't really matter. But all the different modelling suggests that the reduction in your pension through the shift from the collective scheme into the individual scheme that's being proposed will see at least 20, probably 40, some say up to 70 or 80% reductions in our pension. So they're enormous. Just to give you an indication of my own position, I'm a senior lecturer, top of the SL scale. I've got 13 years, as I said, still to go. We accrue pension on 75th, so that's 13 75ths. That would give me around about 9,000 as a pension. Okay? If I was to buy an annuity today, if I was single, I would get £100 a week for an annuity valued at £100,000. I've got a partner, so that reduces it to just over £2,500 a year. So roughly a third or a quarter of what I would get through the DB scheme. I would have to save at least 3 or 4 times that £100,000 over the next 13 years, I would have to have a savings pot, a pension pot, of around £300,000 to £400,000 over the next 13 years. That means me saving around 50 to 60% of my salary over the next 13 years. It ain't going to happen. It ain't going to happen to me, and it ain't going to happen to a lot of people. So the consequences for our pension are dire, and the options for retirement that I might be offered in 13 years' time become a real question for us. So let me just say a few things about what's happening, and I'll leave it there. We can have questions. I do apologise. I do have to rush because I've got a 2 train, so I have to shoot off out just before 2. A couple of things about the scheme. The scheme is fantastically successful. This is one of the scandals about what's happening here. It's an enormous scheme. Pensions, any numbers with pensions are enormous. But it's an enormously successful scheme with around £60 billion of assets. It has what's called a positive cash flow. In other words, it gets in every year more than it pays out because of your contributions and the returns on the investments of those 60 billion. So it grows every year because of that. And as an open scheme, new people coming into it, it's expected to have that feature for at least the next 20, 30 years onwards, if not longer, as far as it's been modelled. So keeping it an open, keeping it a scheme with positive cash flow is extremely important. And it can do that because it's a collective scheme. It's what's referred to as defined benefit, which means you know what you're going to get out, the benefit you're going to get out. It's linked to our salaries, career average these days, it was final salary. But you know what you're going to get out, and the advantage of that is it's because we collectively save. We're not at risk of peculiarities of what happens in the stock market this 12 months before you retire or 6 months before you retire. What the changes represent is abolishing that and moving to a wholly individual scheme. And the point about an individual scheme is you bear the risk. You might do well out of an individual scheme if the assets grow very rapidly and you don't de-risk and there's no slump. But if you want to guarantee your retirement, you start de-risking yourself. You move it to lower value or lower returns in terms of your pension pot, which means you start to get a lower pension. So all of the risk starts to fall on the individual, and that's the real danger with individual defined contribution pension schemes, which is what the proposal to move USS into is about. So that's really what fundamentally is the problem. There's a range of ways you can have a defined benefit scheme. There's talk about the final salary, career average. There's discussions about what the Postal Workers Union are trying to do with something called wage in retirement. They're all collective schemes of one sort or another. And you can argue for or against one or other, but the key point is they reduce the risk on the individual because they share it across the whole scheme. And that's their real advantage. And moving to an individual scheme means that you now bear all of the risk. So that's why we have a real problem here in terms of the employer's proposals. So let me just say a few things about the consequence of doing this and why I think it's not just simply a question of moving from one type of scheme to another, but it puts the whole scheme at risk. If you have two different schemes, the old scheme and the new scheme, a defined benefit and a defined contribution scheme, they can't cross-subsidise one another. So the existing pensions, yours and mine, and existing pensions have to be paid out of the existing pot, this 60 billion that's in existence, of our defined benefit pension that's been built up. And for the future, we're paying into these individual defined contribution schemes. Now, the problem with that defined benefit pot is that the moment you close it to new contributions, as the proposal is to do, to reduce the cap to £0, or if I get time I'll mention a bit about that. But the moment you do that, there's no more income going into it from you and me. The only income coming into it is from the returns on those assets. And pretty quickly, the pensions still have to be paid, pretty quickly you move into what's called a negative cash flow. USS estimate that's probably 5 or 6 years, so it's relatively short term. The negative cash flow starts to emerge. Once that happens, the pensions have to be paid and the funding for those pensions has to be found. It can only be found in a number of ways. The assets are sold, and that's what will happen. They're sold in order to pay current pensions. Pretty quickly, that accelerates the problem of the reduced cash flow coming into the scheme because you've got less assets. You're starting to build up a problem of a deficit emerging. Alternatively, you say, as the rules for the scheme are, that if there's a deficit, ultimately employers have to pay. And Sheffield University will get a bill from USS running into the hundreds of millions of pounds for their contribution to it. That's the rules of the scheme. That will come down, that will bankrupt a number of universities. I don't know about this one, but it will certainly put a huge hit on universities. So the desire to get short-term gains in terms of the pension contributions of 18% the employers want out of this move will suddenly come back to bite them with a huge bill. Or alternatively, the only other alternative is that the risk-sharing agreement that currently exists, in which the employers pay 64%, we pay 35%, whatever it is, it's not quite 2 to 1, that means that's where the deficit is paid for, deficit recovery contributions they're referred to. Now the problem with that is those deficit contributions come out of the employer's 18%, which is our pension. We now start to pay a second time for the pension we've already accrued and bought. So our future pension now starts to accrue much more slowly because there's far less going into it and more of it is going into the deficit recovery contributions. So the real problem of effectively closing the defined benefit scheme is you start to materialise a notional risk that isn't there. This scheme is in surplus to the tune of about £8 billion. It's growing, it's open, it's got £60 billion of assets. Yet they're going to create the deficit that they're afraid of. Quite rightly should be afraid of, and it is unnecessary by ensuring this scheme begins to close and this deficit appears. And again, these are very, very big numbers. The deficit they're talking about is, well, it depends on which version of the week it is, but around 6 to 7 billion. If the full self-sufficiency deficit is 23 billion, as if they could do that. But that's the scale of these numbers. They're enormous once they start creating this deficit. It's worse than that. It's also a problem for the new scheme in terms of the deficit, in terms of the individual defined contribution scheme. As I said, if the deficit appears in the old scheme, it will have to be paid for out of existing contributions, or could be paid for out of existing contributions, which is what the employers currently put into our future pension. So we lose out. We pay a second time for our existing pension. But it's also true for somebody who joins the scheme the day after this change happens. If someone joins the scheme and it only has defined contribution pension contributions, they also pay deficit recovery contributions into a scheme they have no benefit coming out of. Why would a new member of staff on the lowest pay with the worst pension put money, their pension pot, into something else that they get nothing from? The whole defined contribution scheme starts to unravel. And the employers know that too. Because, in this, I won't bother reading the quote, and you can look through it yourself if you want, the employers are not prepared to give a minimum employer contribution to the defined contribution scheme. Why not? Because if they put a minimum in and members start to reduce their contributions, they want to be able to reduce their contributions too. So the whole thing starts to unravel. And, as if I'm not giving you enough bad news as it is, I'd like you to do one thing for me. Go away, Google BBC News, steel pensions, British steel pension. It was in the news last week. This is exactly what's happened in the British steel pension scheme. And what's happened? A group of insurance companies, pension companies, have targeted members and said, you're worried about your pension scheme not paying out on your pension. You're worried about how much you'll get out of it. Why don't you transfer it, which is legally possible under pension freedom, because we can therefore make sure you guarantee getting most of your pension for a fee. And the fees are talking about 10, 15, 20, 25% of people's pensions. There's a whole new scandal emerging here, which I'm no lawyer in economics, I have real difficulty understanding why this isn't criminal, but somebody presumably can explain it to me. It's theft of our pensions that are taking place. And you can see what's happened in the British Steel pension scheme, where this could be in just a few years' time. And that's the risk that people are now being pushed into. And why the issues around USS and the pensions are extremely serious. Do not underestimate how important these things are. And so what I wanted to find out from you is what you think. Email me your views on this. I'll finish up on this so we can have questions and discussion. UCU is balloting its members for industrial action. My feeling, and everyone I talk to, says that if these changes are brought about, if there's no change of heart by the employers and USS, we will end up with industrial action come early in the new year, probably February. By early February is the earliest it can happen. If that happens, it is not the case that the employers and USS are going to change their minds based upon a one-day strike or tokenistic types of action short of strike, working to contract. There is going to be sustained industrial action in this sector if these changes go through and members vote for industrial action, because that's the scale of the importance of what's happening. So don't underestimate the significance of what's happening. Don't underestimate UCU's resolve to challenge this. And my feeling is, I don't think members are going to accept this. I think we are heading to probably the most significant industrial dispute we've ever had in UK higher education. I can't see any other way unless there's a resolution of these issues by the employers. And currently, that doesn't seem to be the case. So this is extremely serious, and I want people to recognise the importance of that. So thanks.
Okay, thank you, Carlo.